There are places in the Pacific Northwest where the forest doesn't just surround you, it swallows you whole, where the canopy grows so thick that noon feels like dusk, and the silence becomes a living thing that presses against your eardrums. The North Cascades is one of those places. Over 500,000 acres of wilderness, most of it untouched, unmapped, and unforgiving. People go there to find solitude, to reconnect with something primal and pure. Most of them come back. Marcus Holloway didn't. September 23, 2021, a Thursday morning that started like any other in Bellingham, Washington. Marcus woke before sunrise, loaded his truck with gear he'd checked 3 times the night before, and kissed his girlfriend Sarah goodbye while she was still half asleep. She remembers mumbling something about being careful, about checking in when he got signal. He promised he would. He always did. Marcus wasn't the kind of person who disappeared. That's what everyone said afterward, when the search teams were combing the trails and the news vans were parked outside the ranger station. He was methodical, prepared, the kind of guy who carried 2 compasses, a satellite messenger, and enough freeze-dried meals to survive a week even though he was only planning 3 days. His photography business was finally taking off. Nature magazines were starting to notice his work, those haunting shots of elk at dawn and eagles cutting through morning fog. He had every reason to be careful, every reason to come home. The trailhead at Diablo Lake sits at the edge of State Route 20, where the highway cuts through mountains that look like they were carved by something angry. Marcus signed the trail register at 7:43 that morning. His handwriting was neat, unhurried. Destination: Thunder Creek Trail, backcountry camping permit for 3 nights. Expected return: Sunday afternoon. The ranger on duty that day, a woman named Patricia Kimball, who'd worked those woods for 16 years, remembered him because he asked about recent bear activity. She told him there'd been sightings, but nothing unusual, just black bears doing what black bears do in late September, fattening up before winter. He thanked her, adjusted the straps on his 70-pound pack, and walked into the forest. That was the last confirmed sighting of Marcus Holloway. Sunday came and went. Sarah tried his cell phone a dozen times, but there was no service that deep in the Cascades. By Monday morning, when he still hadn't shown up at their apartment in Bellingham, she called the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office. They contacted the National Park Service. By Monday afternoon, a search and rescue operation was underway. The thing about searching for someone in the North Cascades is that the wilderness doesn't cooperate. The terrain shifts from dense forest to steep ridgelines to boulder fields where a human body could be hidden in 1,000 different crevices. The weather can change in minutes, clear skies giving way to fog so thick you can't see your own boots. And then there's the sheer size of it. Marcus could have been anywhere within a 50-mile radius of that trailhead. The search teams knew they were looking for a needle in a haystack the size of a small country. They found his truck first, still parked at the trailhead, undisturbed, nothing missing from inside. His spare key was in the magnetic case under the rear bumper, right where Sarah said it would be. No signs of struggle, no indication he'd come back and left again. The truck sat there like a gravestone marking the edge of the known world. Search and rescue brought in dogs on the 2nd day, German shepherds trained to pick up human scent over miles of wilderness. They led the teams up Thunder Creek Trail, past the junction where hikers usually turn toward 4th of July Pass. The dogs were confident at first, noses to the ground, pulling their handlers forward with purpose. But around mile marker 6, something changed. The lead dog, a 7-year-old named Ranger, stopped dead in the middle of the trail. He lifted his head, sniffed the air, and started whining. A high, anxious sound that his handler, a man named Jim Cortez, who'd worked with search dogs for 20 years, had never heard from him before. Jim tried to coax Ranger forward, but the dog planted his feet and refused to move. The other 2 dogs started acting strange too, circling, sniffing the same patch of ground over and over, then backing away. Jim knelt down and examined the area where the dogs had stopped. The trail was unremarkable. Packed dirt, some scattered pine needles, a few rocks. Nothing out of the ordinary, but when he stood up and looked around, he noticed something that made the hair on the back of his neck prickle. The forest was silent. Completely, utterly silent. No birds, no squirrels rustling in the underbrush, no wind moving through the trees. Just a heavy, blanketing quiet that felt wrong in a way Jim couldn't quite articulate. He'd been in these woods hundreds of times, led dozens of search operations, and he'd never experienced anything like it. The silence didn't last long, maybe 30 seconds, but when the sounds of the forest finally returned, the dogs were already backing down the trail. Jim had to practically drag Ranger forward to continue the search. They found Marcus's first campsite 3 miles up the trail. His tent was properly set up, staked down against the wind. His sleeping bag was rolled neatly and strapped to his pack. There was a small fire ring with cold ashes that looked several days old. Everything was in order, methodically arranged the way someone like Marcus would arrange it, but there was no sign of Marcus himself. What they did find, about 20 yards from the campsite, was a set of boot prints, size 10.5, consistent with Marcus's Merrill hiking boots. The prints led away from the tent, heading northeast off the established trail, into thicker forest where the underbrush grew dense and tangled. The search team followed them for about half a mile, using GPS to mark their progress. The prints were clear at first, pressed into soft earth near a seasonal creek, but as the terrain grew rockier, they became harder to follow. And then, near a massive old-growth cedar that must have been 500 years old, the boot prints just stopped. Not faded, not obscured by undergrowth, just stopped, as if Marcus had been lifted straight up into the air. The team spent hours searching that area, expanding in wider and wider circles from where the prints ended. They found nothing. No torn clothing, no dropped equipment, no signs of a struggle. The forest floor was disturbed in places, but it was impossible to tell if that was from wildlife or weather or something else. What bothered Jim, what kept him awake that night back at base camp, was what he'd found about 15 feet to the left of where Marcus's prints disappeared. Another set of tracks, larger, deeper. At first glance, they looked like bear prints. The Pacific Northwest is full of black bears, some pushing 400 pounds, and their tracks can look unsettling if you're not used to seeing them. But these didn't quite match. They were too narrow for a bear, the claw marks too far forward. Jim took photographs, made plaster casts, and sent them to a wildlife biologist at the University of Washington. The biologist's report came back 3 days later. The tracks were consistent with a large black bear, but there were irregularities in the gait pattern and claw placement that are atypical for the species. In other words, probably a bear, but something about it wasn't quite right. The search continued for 11 days. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras flew grid patterns over the forest. Volunteer groups from Bellingham and Seattle hiked every major trail within a 10-mile radius. Marcus's face was on the news every night. That photo Sarah had taken of him at Paradise on Mount Rainier, smiling with his camera around his neck, mountains rising behind him. The story went regional, then national. People from all over the country called in with tips and theories and supposed sightings. None of them led anywhere. Sarah stayed in a motel in Marble Mount, a tiny town at the western edge of the Cascades, waiting for news. She spent her days at the command post, making coffee for volunteers, marking maps, doing anything to feel useful. At night, she'd walk back to the motel and try to convince herself that Marcus was still alive out there, that he'd injured himself somehow and was hunkered down waiting for rescue, that any day now they'd find him and this nightmare would be over. On the 10th day of the search, she was interviewed by a local news crew. The reporter asked her what she thought had happened, if she had any theories. Sarah's answer was simple and heartbreaking. Marcus knows these woods. He's careful. Something had to have gone wrong, something unexpected. I just want him to come home. But the forest kept its secrets. By early October, the official search was scaled back. The temperature was dropping. Snow was forecast for the higher elevations, and the incident commander made the difficult decision to suspend active operations. They'd covered hundreds of square miles and found almost nothing. Marcus Holloway was officially listed as missing, presumed lost in the North Cascades wilderness. The case remained open, but without new leads, there was nowhere left to look. Sarah went back to Bellingham. She kept Marcus's phone active, paying the bill every month just in case. She left his clothes in the closet, his favorite mug on the kitchen counter, his photography equipment in their spare bedroom exactly where he'd left it. Their friends tried to help, tried to pull her back into the world of the living, But how do you move on when there's no body, no closure, no answers? Marcus hadn't died. He'd simply vanished, swallowed by trees and stone and silence. The months crawled past. Winter came and buried the Cascades under 20 feet of snow. Spring brought melt-off and mudslides that reshaped the landscape. Summer tourists flooded the trails, most of them unaware that a man had disappeared there less than a year ago. Sarah marked the first anniversary of Marcus's disappearance alone in their apartment, looking through his photographs on an external hard drive, trying to see what he'd seen through that lens. By the summer of 2023, Marcus Holloway had become another name on the list of people who'd gone missing in America's wilderness. The National Park Service keeps that list, though they don't publicize it much. Over 1,600 people have vanished in national parks and forests since record-keeping began. Some are found eventually, bodies recovered from crevasses or river bottoms, victims of accidents or exposure or simple bad luck, but others, like Marcus, leave no trace. They step off the edge of the map and never come back. The case might have stayed cold forever, if not for a couple of amateur mushroom hunters from Concrete, Washington. October 8th, 2023, 2 years and 15 days after Marcus disappeared. Tom and Linda Vasquez were out foraging for chanterelles in an area about 4 miles northeast of Thunder Creek Trail. It was Linda's hobby. She sold wild mushrooms at the farmer's market on weekends and had gotten good at finding the secret spots where chanterelles grew thick in the moss. They were off-trail, bushwhacking through dense undergrowth near that same massive cedar where the search dogs had lost Marcus's scent 2 years earlier. Linda almost stepped on it, a patch of disturbed ground, slightly sunken, covered in a thin layer of moss that looked too uniform, too deliberate. Something made her stop and kneel down. She brushed away the moss with her gloved hand. Underneath was loose soil, darker than the surrounding earth, and then her fingers touched something hard, plastic. Black plastic. She called Tom over. Together, they carefully excavated the object, pulling away moss and dirt with the gentle precision of archaeologists. What emerged was a Nikon D850 camera body, mud-caked and scratched, with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens still attached. The lens cap was missing. The camera strap was frayed as if it had been partially torn. Tom, who'd been following the Holloway case since it happened, felt his stomach drop. He told Linda not to touch anything else. He pulled out his cell phone, no signal this deep in the woods, and they hiked back to the trailhead as fast as they could. By 4 that afternoon, they were at the Marble Mount Ranger Station, the muddy camera sitting on Patricia Kimball's desk like evidence from another world. The Whatcom County Sheriff's Office reopened the case that same day. Was it really Marcus's camera, or just a strange coincidence in a forest full of mysteries? The camera was photographed, documented, and transported to the forensics lab in Bellingham under chain of custody protocols. Detective Ray Kowalski, who'd been the lead investigator on Marcus's case from the beginning, handled it personally. He was a 28-year veteran of the sheriff's office, a methodical man who'd worked dozens of missing persons cases over his career. Most of them ended badly. He'd learned not to get his hopes up, but this was different. This was something. The serial number on the camera body matched Marcus Holloway's registered equipment. That confirmation came through in less than 24 hours. Sarah received the call on a Tuesday evening while she was grocery shopping. She abandoned her cart in the middle of the produce section and drove straight to the sheriff's office, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. They sat her down in a small conference room with pale green walls and fluorescent lights that hummed like insects. Detective Kowalski was gentle with her, the way he'd been throughout the entire investigation. He explained what they'd found, where they'd found it, what it might mean. Sarah listened with her hands folded in her lap, her face carefully neutral, because after 2 years she'd learned how to hold herself together in public. "Can I see it?" she asked. Kowalski hesitated, then nodded. He left the room and returned a moment later, with the camera sealed in a clear evidence bag. Even through the plastic, Sarah recognized it immediately, the small dent on the bottom plate from when Marcus had dropped it on their kitchen floor. The custom strap he'd ordered from a leather worker in Portland, the piece of green tape he'd put over the Nikon logo because he said it was too shiny and spooked wildlife. She pressed her fingers against the plastic bag, as close to touching it as the evidence protocols would allow. This had been in Marcus's hands. He'd looked through this viewfinder, adjusted these dials, captured images with this sensor. It was a piece of him, returned from the void. "What was on the memory card?" she asked quietly. Kowalski glanced at his partner, Deputy Linda Chen, who'd been standing by the door. Chen was younger, sharp-eyed, with a background in digital forensics that made her invaluable on cases like this. She pulled out a tablet and brought up a file directory. "We recovered 63 images," Chen said. "Most of them are from the days before he disappeared. Landscape shots, wildlife, the kinds of things you'd expect from a nature photographer." Sarah nodded. That sounded right. Marcus would shoot hundreds of frames on a trip like that, editing them down later. "But the last 7 photos are different," Chen continued, her voice careful. "And they're going to be hard to look at. Not because they're graphic, they're not, but because they don't make sense." She turned the tablet so Sarah could see. The first image filled the screen. It was a landscape shot taken from a high vantage point, probably a ridge or outcropping. The North Cascades stretched out in layers of blue-gray mountains, fading into hazy distance. The composition was beautiful, classically Marcus, the rule of thirds perfectly balanced, the light soft and diffuse. The timestamp read September 24, 2021, 4:47 p.m. Chen swiped to the next photo. Same location, slightly different angle. Then another, this one of a marmot sitting on a sun-warmed rock. Then a close-up of some kind of wildflower Sarah didn't recognize. Standard nature photography, the kind of work Marcus did in his sleep. Then the images changed. Photo number 60. Taken at 9:23 p.m. that night. The flash had fired, lighting up what looked like the interior of Marcus's tent. The image was slightly blurred, as if the camera had been moving when the shutter clicked. You could see the orange fabric of the tent wall, part of a sleeping bag, the corner of a backpack. Nothing unusual, except for one detail that Chen had to zoom in for Sarah to see properly. There, in the lower right corner of the frame, barely visible, a shadow on the tent wall. Not Marcus's shadow. The angle was wrong for that. This shadow was outside the tent, cast by something tall and broad-shouldered, distorted by the curve of the fabric. "Could be a tree," Chen said neutrally, "or another camper passing by." Photo 61. Taken 4 minutes later, at 9:27 p.m. This one was shot from outside the tent, camera pointed toward the forest. The flash illuminated maybe 20 feet of trees and undergrowth before darkness swallowed everything. The exposure was all wrong. The flash couldn't reach far enough, leaving most of the frame in impenetrable shadow. But there, at the very edge of the light's reach, something reflective caught the flash. 2 small points of light, about 7 feet off the ground, that could have been eyes, or water droplets on leaves, or a trick of the lens. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Photo 62. 10:03 p.m. Another shot of the forest, different direction. The flash illuminated a massive tree trunk, some ferns, a scatter of rocks. And there, in the mid-ground, something that looked like it might be a print in the soft earth, too blurred to make out clearly, but large, definitely large. "We had a wildlife analyst examine this one," Kowalski said. "He thinks it's a bear track, partially obscured by shadows and the camera angle." "But he's not certain?" Sarah asked. "He's not certain," Kowalski admitted. Photo 63, 11:47 p.m. The last image Marcus Holloway ever took. Complete blackness. No flash, or the flash had failed, or the lens cap had been on. The entire frame was dark except for a few pixels of noise scattered across the sensor. Chen had run it through enhancement software, trying to pull out any hidden details. But there was nothing there. Just darkness and digital grain. What made it significant was the metadata. The camera's internal accelerometer had recorded that the device was in motion when this photo was taken, moving fast, being jostled or shaken. And the GPS coordinates embedded in the file placed the camera approximately 300 yards from Marcus's campsite, in the same direction his boot prints had been heading when they disappeared. "That's the last activity recorded by the camera," Chen said. "After this photo, nothing. The device was either turned off or the battery died." Sarah stared at that wall of black pixels, trying to imagine what Marcus had been doing at 11:47 p.m., 300 yards from his tent, taking a photograph of nothing, or trying to take a photograph of something in the darkness that his flash couldn't illuminate. Why would he leave his tent at midnight? She asked. Marcus was always in bed by 9 when he was camping. He liked to get up before dawn to catch the morning light. It was a good question, and nobody had a good answer. The sheriff's office organized a new search operation, focused on the area where the camera had been found. This time they had a more precise location to work with, a tighter search grid. Forensic teams went out with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. If Marcus had died out there, and after 2 years that was the assumption everyone was working with, there should be remains somewhere in that vicinity. They found more boot prints. Weathered and partially eroded, but definitely there. Preserved in a small hollow where runoff had deposited a layer of fine silt that had hardened over time. The prints matched Marcus's Merrill boots. They led in a wandering pattern through dense undergrowth, circling back on themselves several times, as if he'd been disoriented or searching for something. And they found other tracks too. Those same large, ambiguous prints that Jim Cortez had found 2 years earlier. The forensic team made fresh casts. They brought in Dr. Sarah Nguyen, a wildlife biologist from Washington State University who specialized in carnivore ecology. Dr. Nguyen examined the casts in her lab, compared them to reference collections of bear and cougar tracks, ran measurements and statistical analyses. Her preliminary report was cautious and carefully worded. The tracks were morphologically consistent, with a large black bear, estimated weight between 350 and 400 pounds. But there were anomalies. The stride length was irregular. The claw marks were unusually pronounced and positioned slightly lateral to where bear claws typically register. And there was what she called an unexpected depth pattern suggesting bipedal movement in several sequences, though this could be an artifact of substrate conditions. In other words, probably a bear, but one moving in a way that bears don't usually move. The local news picked up the story again. Marcus Holloway's disappearance had never completely left the regional consciousness. People in small towns remember their mysteries, but now it was back on the front page. The discovery of the camera, the strange photographs, the ambiguous tracks. Reporters started using phrases like unexplained circumstances and baffling evidence. A few of the more sensationalist outlets began hinting at something stranger, something that sold papers and got clicks. Tom Vasquez, the mushroom hunter who'd found the camera, was interviewed on a podcast that specialized in wilderness mysteries. He was reluctant to speculate, careful with his words, but the host kept pushing him to talk about what he'd felt when they'd found that buried camera. It was just off, Tom said finally. The way it was buried. Not deep enough to be intentional, like someone was trying to hide it, but not shallow enough to be accidental, like it just got covered by leaves and debris over time. It was in between, and the moss growing over it. Linda knows plants better than I do, but she said that moss takes time to establish like that, months, maybe a year. So the camera had been there a while, but something had buried it. Deliberately or not, I don't know. The host asked if he thought something had taken Marcus. Something other than a bear or a cougar or natural causes. Tom was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've hunted these mountains for 30 years. I know what's out there. Black bears, sure. Cougars occasionally. Elk, deer, coyotes. But there are places in those woods where the forest just feels different. Older. Like you're being watched by something that was here long before people were. Most of the time you can chalk it up to imagination or nerves. But every once in a while you find something that makes you wonder. Could a man really vanish so completely? Or was something out there erasing the evidence? The search teams found other items too, scattered over a quarter-mile radius from where the camera had been buried. A blue bandana that Sarah confirmed was Marcus's. One of his water bottles, empty, wedged between 2 rocks near a creek. A protein bar wrapper with his favorite brand. These were breadcrumbs, pieces of his passage through that forest, but they didn't add up to a coherent picture. What they didn't find was Marcus. Detective Kowalski spent hours hiking those trails himself, trying to build a timeline of Marcus's last movements. The camera told them he'd been alive and taking photos as late as 11:47 p.m. on September 24th. The boot prints showed he'd been mobile, walking, though possibly confused or in distress. But then the trail just ended. No body. No skeletal remains. No shredded clothing or drag marks or any of the other signs you'd expect if a predator had taken him. Kowalski had worked cases where bears had killed hikers. It was rare, but it happened. Black bears were generally timid, but a startled bear or a mother with cubs could be deadly. When it happened, though, there was evidence. Blood, torn fabric, disturbed earth, where the body had been partially consumed or cached under dirt and branches. Bears were messy predators. They left traces. This was different. This was clean. Too clean. On the 19th of October, Kowalski drove out to Marble Mount to interview some of the locals who'd lived in the area for decades. Small mountain towns are repositories of knowledge that never makes it into official records. Stories passed down, strange encounters, the things people see but don't report because they know how it'll sound. He sat in a diner called the Mountain View, which had no view of anything except the parking lot, and talked to a retired logging foreman named Carl Brennan. Carl was in his 70s, weathered and lean, with the kind of hands that had spent a lifetime working heavy machinery in dangerous terrain. "You're asking about strange things in those woods," Carl said, stirring sugar into his coffee. "That's a big question." Kowalski waited. He'd learned that the best way to get people talking was to stay quiet and let them fill the silence. "I worked timber up in those mountains for 42 years, Carl continued. "Saw a lot of country most people never get to. And yeah, there were places that felt wrong. Places where the crew wouldn't work unless we stayed in groups. Places where equipment would malfunction for no reason. Where chainsaws would die and radios would go to static." "Did you ever see anything? Anything you couldn't explain?" Carl looked out the diner window at the grey October sky. "Once," he said quietly, "back in '97, we were working a clear cut about 8 miles up from Diablo Lake. I was walking a perimeter, checking boundary markers, and I came across this tree. Big cedar, maybe 8 feet in diameter, old as the mountain itself, and the bark on one side had been stripped away. Not by bears, I know what bear damage looks like. This was different. Long parallel gouges, deep ones, cutting through bark and into heartwood. They started about 4 feet off the ground and went up to maybe 12 feet. Whatever made them was tall and strong and angry. Could it have been a bulldozer? Equipment damage? We hadn't worked that section yet, and the marks were fresh, sap still running. I called over my crew boss, guy named Danny Ortiz. He took one look and told me we were moving our operation a mile west. Said he didn't want to work near whatever had done that." Kowalski made notes. "Did you report it?" "To who?" "The Forest Service. They'd have told me it was a bear standing on his hind legs. Maybe it was. But I've seen a lot of bear sign in my life, detective. And that wasn't it." These stories were everywhere once Kowalski started asking. A park ranger who'd found a deer carcass hung in a tree 20 feet off the ground, draped over a branch, in a way that required strength no animal in Washington state possessed. A fly fisherman who'd been camping near Ross Lake and woke in the night to something circling his tent, footsteps that sounded too heavy to be human, but too deliberate to be a bear. A wildlife photographer who'd found a series of rock cairns arranged in a perfect line through the forest, each one exactly 40 paces from the next, leading toward nothing. None of it was concrete. None of it was evidence that would hold up in any official investigation, but collectively, it painted a picture of a wilderness that held secrets, of something in those mountains that people felt but couldn't quite name. Sarah heard these stories too. She'd started her own investigation, reaching out to hiking forums and missing persons groups, trying to find patterns. What she discovered unsettled her. Marcus wasn't the only person who'd vanished in the North Cascades under strange circumstances. There was Jennifer Klein, a trail runner who disappeared in 2015 near Cascade Pass. Her running shoes had been found lined up neatly on a boulder, laces tied, as if she'd removed them carefully and walked away. There was David Chen, a geology student who'd gone missing in 2008 while doing field research. His tent had been found intact, his equipment undisturbed, but David was gone. And there were others, going back decades, names and dates and locations that formed a constellation of disappearances across the map. Most of them had never been solved. Sarah made a map. She pinned it up in the spare bedroom, connecting locations with red string like something out of a conspiracy theorist's nightmare. But when she stepped back and looked at the pattern, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The disappearances clustered around specific areas, remote valleys, old-growth sections, places where the forest was thickest and oldest, and least touched by human activity. Places where something might still live undisturbed. She called Detective Kowalski and told him what she'd found. He came over that evening, stood in the spare bedroom, and studied her map for a long time without speaking. "What do you think it means?" Sarah asked finally. Kowalski rubbed his jaw. He looked tired, older than his 53 years. "I think it means the wilderness is dangerous," he said carefully. "People make mistakes. They get lost, they fall, they succumb to exposure. The more remote the area, the less likely we are to find remains." "But you don't believe that?" He met her eyes. "I believe there's something we're not seeing. Whether it's a pattern of human error or something else, I don't know." Late that night, after Kowalski had left, Sarah sat in the darkness of the spare bedroom, looking at her map, at all those red pins marking places where people had walked into the forest and never walked out. She thought about Marcus out there in the midnight darkness, 300 yards from his tent, taking a photograph of something he couldn't see. She thought about that last image, that wall of black, and wondered what had been there just beyond the reach of his flash. Wondered if he'd known in those final moments that he was being hunted. The forensic analysis of Marcus's camera took 3 weeks. The device had spent 2 years buried in forest soil, exposed to moisture, temperature fluctuations, and the slow chemical processes of organic decay. That it worked at all was remarkable. That it still held recoverable data was borderline miraculous. Chen worked with a specialist from the FBI's Digital Forensics Unit, a woman named Dr. Amanda Reeves, who'd spent her career extracting information from damaged electronics. They disassembled the camera in a clean room, carefully removing the memory card and connecting it to specialized recovery equipment. Modern digital cameras store more than just images. They record a wealth of metadata that most people never think about. GPS coordinates, accelerometer data, timestamps down to the millisecond, even information about lens position and focus distance. It was this hidden data that told the real story. Chen called Sarah and Kowalski in for a briefing on November 3rd. They met in a conference room at the FBI field office in Seattle, sitting around a table with Chen's laptop at the center. Dr. Reeves joined them via video conference, her face pixelated on a screen mounted to the wall. "We've reconstructed Marcus's movements on the night of September 24th, Chen began, pulling up a digital map on her laptop. "At least his camera's movements. We're assuming he had it with him." The map showed the terrain around Thunder Creek Trail in 3-dimensional topography. A red line traced a path from Marcus's campsite, marked with a small tent icon, into the forest to the northeast. Photo 60, taken at 9:23 p.m., was shot from inside the tent. We know this from the GPS coordinates and the content of the image. Chen clicked forward. Then, 4 minutes later, he's outside. Photo 61 is taken approximately 30 yards from the tent, heading northeast. "Why did he leave the tent?" Sarah asked. "That's the question. The photos suggest he heard or saw something that made him investigate. Look at the sequence." Chen brought up the images side by side. Photo 61 is hasty. The focus is soft, the composition random. This isn't a planned shot. He's using the camera as a tool, trying to illuminate something in the darkness. Photo 62, taken 36 minutes later, showed Marcus had moved deeper into the forest. The GPS data placed him 140 yards from his tent. The accelerometer showed the camera had been in motion almost continuously during that gap, not being carried in a smooth walking motion, but jerked and jolted, as if Marcus had been moving fast through difficult terrain. "He was running," Kowalski said quietly. Dr. Reeves nodded from the screen. "The movement data supports that interpretation, and here's where it gets interesting." She highlighted a graph showing accelerometer readings over time. "See these spikes? Those are impacts, the camera hitting against his body as he ran. But look at the intervals. They're irregular. He's not maintaining a steady pace. He's stopping and starting, changing direction. Like he was being chased," Sarah whispered. "Or like he was chasing something," Chen countered. "We can't determine directionality from this data alone. But the final photo, that black frame taken at 11:47 p.m., told a different story. Dr. Reeves pulled up an enhanced version of the metadata. The GPS places this shot 273 yards from the tent, in a dense section of forest near a seasonal drainage. The accelerometer shows extreme motion, violent shaking. And then, exactly 1.4 seconds after this photo was taken, the camera experienced an impact, consistent with being dropped or thrown. After that, no activity. The device powered down or was damaged. Sarah stared at that black image. So something happened at 11:47, right there. That's where we should search. We have searched, Kowalski said. That's within 50 yards of where Tom Vasquez found the camera. We've had teams comb that entire area. Then search again. The temperature in the North Cascades was dropping as November settled in. Snow had already fallen at higher elevations, and more was forecast. If they were going to find anything else, it had to be now, before winter locked the mountains down for 6 months. Kowalski organized one final sweep. This time they brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment and a forensic anthropologist named Dr. James Whitmore, who specialized in wilderness recovery. Dr. Whitmore was in his 60s, a soft-spoken man with decades of experience finding bodies in places where nature had tried to hide them. The team hiked in on November 7th, under gray skies that threatened rain. Sarah insisted on coming along, and Kowalski didn't have the heart to refuse her. She wore Marcus's spare hiking jacket, still hanging in their closet after 2 years, and carried a day pack with water and emergency supplies. They reached the search area by noon. Dr. Whitmore set up the ground-penetrating radar and began running systematic sweeps across the terrain. The device looked like a lawnmower with a computer screen attached, sending electromagnetic pulses into the earth and mapping what lay beneath. It could detect disturbed soil, voids, objects, anything that created a density anomaly underground. For 3 hours, they found nothing. The forest floor was a jumble of roots and rocks and decaying organic matter, all of it creating false signals that had to be investigated and dismissed. It was slow, painstaking work. Sarah stood at the edge of the search grid, watching the team move back and forth with their equipment, and felt hope bleeding away with each empty hole they dug. Then, at 3:17 p.m., the radar caught something. Dr. Whitmore called everyone over. He pointed to a section of the screen showing a clear anomaly about 18 inches below the surface. The shape was irregular but dense. Not a rock, not a root. Something else. They excavated carefully, using small trowels and brushes, treating it like an archaeological dig. The soil was dark and rich, full of earthworms and beetles that scattered as they worked deeper. 6 inches down, they hit something solid. Blue fabric, muddy and deteriorating, Marcus's backpack. They lifted it out piece by piece. 2 years underground had not been kind to it. The nylon was torn in several places, the zippers corroded, the shoulder straps nearly rotted through. But inside, protected by layers of fabric and sealed plastic bags, they found items that had survived. A waterproof stuff sack containing Marcus's wallet and identification. A first aid kit, still sealed. A headlamp with dead batteries. A small journal wrapped in a Ziploc bag. Sarah reached for the journal, but Kowalski gently stopped her. "Evidence protocol," he said quietly. "We'll get it processed and then you can see it." But they could see through the plastic bag that there was writing inside. Marcus's handwriting filling the pages. The team kept searching. If the backpack was here, buried deliberately or covered by natural processes, then maybe other items were nearby. Maybe Marcus himself was nearby. They expanded the search grid, running the radar over every square foot of ground within a 100-yard radius. They found his satellite messenger 20 feet away, buried even deeper. The device was rugged, designed to survive drops and impacts and harsh weather. It should have been functional, but when Dr. Whitmore powered it up back at the lab, they discovered the internal GPS antenna had been physically damaged. Not broken by impact, but crushed, as if something had squeezed the device with tremendous force. And they found one more thing, something that nobody could explain, pressed into a patch of clay soil that had baked hard over 2 dry summers, preserved like a fossil, a handprint, human-sized but wrong in the details. The palm was too broad, the fingers too long, the thumb positioned at an angle that didn't match human anatomy. Dr. Whitmore made a cast of it, photographed it from every angle, and sent the images to a forensic anthropologist at the Smithsonian. The response came back 3 days later. Indeterminate origin, not consistent with human hand morphology, possibly an artifact of soil deformation or animal activity overlapping with human contact. Possibly. Marcus's journal was processed in the forensics lab, each page carefully photographed and documented before being released to Sarah. Kowalski gave it to her in a manila envelope on November 15th, exactly 2 years, 1 month, and 22 days after Marcus had walked into the forest. She took it home and sat at the kitchen table with it for an hour before she could bring herself to open it. This was Marcus's voice, his thoughts from those final days. Reading it felt like crossing a threshold she couldn't uncross. The early entries were normal. Marcus wrote about the drive out to the trailhead, about the weather forecast looking good, about the photography he was hoping to accomplish. His handwriting was neat and unhurried. On the first day of hiking he'd written, "Made it to the first campsite by 3 p.m. Set up tent near the creek. The light here is incredible, that late afternoon gold coming through the cedars. Got some shots I think could be portfolio-worthy. Saw a black bear across the creek maybe 150 yards away. He didn't notice me. Beautiful animal. The second day, woke at dawn. Hiked up to the ridge to catch sunrise. Absolutely worth it. The alpenglow on the peaks was unreal. Spent most of the day shooting landscapes and doing some macro work with mushrooms and lichen. Feeling good. Weather holding. Miss Sarah, but it's nice to have this quiet time. Normal, mundane. The kind of entries you'd expect from a careful, methodical person documenting a solo trip. Then the third day, September 24th. The handwriting started to change, not drastically, but noticeably. A little less neat, written faster. Something strange happened this morning. Was eating breakfast outside the tent around 7 a.m. when I heard this sound. Hard to describe. Not quite a growl, not quite a voice. Deep and resonant, coming from up the slope, maybe 200 yards away. I grabbed the camera and hiked up to investigate. Didn't find anything, but I did find tracks, really big tracks. Probably a bear, but they looked odd to me, too narrow, and the claw marks seemed wrong somehow. I'm probably overthinking it. Bears are common here. But something about those tracks made me uneasy. The entry from that afternoon, decided to stay an extra night at this campsite instead of pushing on to the next one. I keep feeling like something's watching me. Every time I'm working with the camera, getting focused on a shot, I get this prickling feeling on the back of my neck. When I turn around, there's nothing there. Just trees and shadows. I know it's probably just my imagination. Solo camping can do that to you. Make you hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. But I've done dozens of solo trips and never felt like this before. Something feels wrong here. Sarah's hands were shaking as she turned to the final entry, written that evening. The handwriting was rushed now, the lines slanting downward across the page. 8:47 p.m. I'm in the tent. It's outside. I don't know what it is, but it's been circling the campsite for the past 20 minutes. I can hear it moving through the underbrush, heavy footsteps, branches breaking. Too big to be a deer, too deliberate to be a bear. I looked out through the tent flap a few minutes ago. Couldn't see anything, but I could smell it. This weird damp smell, like wet fur and something else. Something rotten. I'm trying to stay calm. I have bear spray. I have the satellite messenger. If it's a bear, it'll probably just leave. Bears don't usually want anything to do with people. But I don't think it's a bear. The way it's moving, stopping and starting like it's investigating, like it's trying to figure out what I am, and it's smart. I can feel that somehow. This isn't just an animal following its instincts. This is something thinking, calculating. 9:15 p.m. It's at the tent. Right outside. I can see the shadow of it against the fabric. It's tall, so tall, standing on 2 legs. I took a photo, but I don't think the flash reached it. My hands are shaking too much to hold the camera steady. It's not making any noise now, just standing there watching. I need to do something. I can't just wait here. If I stay in the tent, I'm trapped. But if I go outside... The entry ended there, mid-sentence. The rest of the page was blank. Sarah flipped through the remaining pages, desperate for more, but they were empty. Whatever had happened after 9:15 p.m., Marcus hadn't had time to write about it. She sat there in the kitchen, staring at that unfinished sentence, and understood with terrible clarity what Marcus's final hours had been like. The fear, the indecision, the desperate hope that this was all some misunderstanding, that he was panicking over nothing, that morning would come and he'd feel foolish for being so scared. But morning hadn't come, not for Marcus. She called Kowalski immediately. He came over and read the journal himself, his face growing more troubled with each page. When he finished, he sat back and exhaled slowly. "This changes things," he said. "It means something killed him," Sarah said, her voice hollow. "Something that wasn't a bear. Something that stood outside his tent for God knows how long before whatever happened." Kowalski didn't disagree. He couldn't. The journal was evidence, and evidence had to be taken seriously, no matter how strange it sounded. The sheriff's office consulted with wildlife experts, behavioral psychologists, anyone who might offer an explanation. The prevailing theory was that Marcus had encountered a bear exhibiting unusual behavior, possibly a bear habituated to humans, or one with a medical condition affecting its conduct. The standing on two legs behavior, while uncommon, wasn't unheard of. Bears could stand upright to investigate scents or to get a better view. The smell Marcus described could have been a bear in rut, or one that had been feeding on carrion. But then there was Dr. Nguyen's analysis of the claw marks found on trees near the campsite, marks that went 12 feet up the trunk, marks that showed a strength and reach that pushed the boundaries of what even a large black bear could accomplish. "I'm not saying it's impossible, Dr. Bao," Nguyen told Kowalski during a phone call. "I'm saying it's highly improbable. For a black bear to make marks that high, it would need to be standing fully upright with its front legs extended overhead. That's not a natural behavior for Ursus americanus. They don't feed that way, they don't mark territory that way, it doesn't fit the ethology." "So what does fit?" A long pause. "I don't know, Detective, and that's what bothers me." By late November, the story had spread beyond regional news. A podcaster from California drove up to interview Sarah and Kowalski. A documentary filmmaker requested access to case files. Online forums dedicated to unexplained disappearances were filled with theories ranging from the rational to the ridiculous. Some people thought Marcus had simply gotten lost and died of exposure, that his journal reflected stress-induced paranoia. Others believed something else had taken him, something that lived in the remote wilderness, unknown to science. The most persistent theory involved a creature that had been part of indigenous storytelling for centuries. The tribes of the Pacific Northwest had many names for it. The Lummi called it Tisameques. The Salish spoke of Saskets. European settlers had called it Bigfoot, reducing ancient legend to cryptid curiosity. But the original stories were more nuanced than that. They spoke of a being that existed at the boundary between the human and animal worlds, a guardian of wild places, a thing to be respected and feared. Sarah didn't know what to believe. Part of her wanted a rational explanation, an accident, an animal attack, something that fit within the known world. But another part of her, the part that had read Marcus's journal and felt the terror in those final rushed words, knew that something had been out there with him, something real. The question was, what? Was Marcus hunted by nature's predator or by something older than we can name? The first snowfall of the season blanketed the North Cascades on November 28th. 6 inches fell overnight, transforming the forest into a monochrome landscape of white and shadow. Any remaining evidence was now buried, preserved in frozen soil until spring. The window for finding Marcus's body, if there was a body to find, had closed. Detective Kowalski stood in his office, looking at the caseboard covered in photos and maps and notes. 2 years of work, all leading to more questions than answers. He'd spent his career dealing with uncertainties, with cases that didn't resolve cleanly, but this one haunted him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He thought about that last journal entry, about Marcus in his tent, listening to something circle in the darkness, about the choice he'd made, stay or flee, and how that choice had determined everything that followed. Kowalski had been in law enforcement long enough to know that the world was full of mysteries that never got solved. People vanished. Evidence disappeared. Sometimes the wilderness won and kept its secrets. But he also knew that evidence didn't bury itself. Cameras didn't hide themselves beneath moss and soil. Something had been there with Marcus that night. Something had acted with intention. Whether that something walked on 4 legs or 2, whether it was catalogued by science or lived only in shadow and story, Detective Ray Kowalski couldn't say. But it was out there still, in those mountains, in those old forests where the trees grow so thick that daylight never quite reaches the ground, and it was waiting for whoever walked in next. Winter passed slowly in Bellingham. Sarah went through the motions of living, Work, errands, the small rituals that keep a person tethered to the world. But part of her remained in that forest, trapped in the moment between Marcus's last journal entry and whatever came after. That blank space where his story ended and silence began, she couldn't let it go. In March of 2024, when the snow began to melt and the high mountain passes reopened, Sarah made a decision. She was going back to the North Cascades. Not with search teams or investigators or anyone else, alone. She needed to stand in the place where Marcus had last stood, to see what he'd seen, to understand in whatever way she could. Detective Kowalski tried to talk her out of it. Sarah, it's not safe. Whatever happened to Marcus, I need to know, she interrupted. I need to see that place. I don't know. Say goodbye, maybe. Get closure. Something. He understood. After months of working this case, reading Marcus's words, studying his photographs, Kowalski had developed his own need for answers. So he made her promise 3 things: carry a satellite messenger at all times, check in every 6 hours, and take someone with her. Sarah agreed to the first 2. The third she couldn't promise. But she wasn't entirely alone. Patricia Kimball, the ranger who'd been the last official person to see Marcus alive, volunteered to accompany her. Patricia was close to retirement, weathered by decades in these mountains, and she understood what Sarah needed in a way that most people couldn't. They hiked in on March 21st, the spring equinox. The forest was in that transitional state between winter and spring, patches of snow still clinging to shaded hollows, the first wildflowers pushing up through wet earth, the trees beginning to bud. The air smelled of thaw and pine, and the sweet rot of last year's leaves. It took them most of the day to reach the area where Marcus's camera and backpack had been found. Patricia knew these trails intimately, could read the landscape like text, pointing out features that meant nothing to Sarah, but everything to someone who lived in this wilderness. They set up camp as the sun dropped behind the western peaks, painting the sky in layers of orange and purple. Sarah's tent was modern and light, nothing like Marcus's heavier gear, but she found herself thinking about that last night, about him lying in the darkness, listening to something circle outside. The forest was alive with sound, birds calling their evening songs, squirrels chattering in the branches, a creek somewhere nearby running loud with snowmelt. Normal sounds, natural sounds, nothing that suggested anything was wrong. But as full darkness settled over the forest, Sarah understood something she hadn't before. Night in the wilderness isn't like night in the city. There are no streetlights, no ambient glow, no human sounds to remind you that civilization exists. There's only darkness, absolute and encompassing, and the small circle of light from your headlamp that makes everything beyond it seem more ominous. She sat by the fire Patricia had built, watching shadows dance at the edge of the light, and tried to imagine what Marcus had felt. The fear, the uncertainty, the terrible knowledge that he was alone and vulnerable, and that something was out there paying attention to him. "You okay?" Patricia asked, handing her a cup of instant coffee. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "Being here, it makes it real in a way it wasn't before. Does that make sense?" "It does." Patricia poked at the fire, sending sparks spiraling up into darkness. "I've been working these mountains for 17 years. I've seen people come and go, seen accidents happen, seen the forest take people who weren't careful. But Marcus's case is different. I've thought about it constantly since that day he signed the trail register. What do you think happened to him?" Patricia was quiet for a long time. "Officially? I think he encountered a bear. Got spooked, ran, fell in the darkness, and died of injuries or exposure in a place where we haven't found him yet. The North Cascades has 1,000 ways to kill you, and most of them leave no trace." "And unofficially?" Another long silence. Then Patricia said, "My grandmother was Nooksack. She told me stories when I was young, about the old ones who lived in the deep forest. Not animals, not people, something in between. She said they were here before humans came, and they'd be here after we're gone. She said they mostly avoided people, but sometimes, if someone went too deep into their territory, if someone saw something they weren't supposed to see..." She trailed off, staring into the flames. "Do you believe that?" Sarah asked. "I believe there are things in these mountains we don't understand. I believe indigenous peoples lived in balance with this land for thousands of years, And they didn't do that by being ignorant. Their stories weren't just entertainment. They were warnings, maps of reality that included more than what shows up in a biology textbook. Sarah looked out into the darkness beyond their fire. So something is out there. Something is always out there, Patricia said. The question is whether it's something we have names for. They took turns keeping watch that night, though neither of them really slept. Sarah lay in her tent listening to every sound, every crack of a branch, every rustle in the undergrowth. Her rational mind told her she was safe, that lightning doesn't strike twice, that whatever had happened to Marcus was a singular tragedy unlikely to repeat. But some older part of her brain, the part that remembered when humans were prey, not predator, stayed alert and afraid. Nothing happened. Morning came grey and cold, with fog settling into the valleys like something living. They broke camp and began exploring the immediate area, Sarah following the GPS coordinates from Marcus's camera, trying to retrace his path. She found the spot where he'd taken that last photograph. She stood there with her own camera, looking at the same trees he'd looked at, breathing the same air. And she felt it, that sense of being watched, of the forest holding its breath. "Marcus," she whispered. "I'm here. I came back for you." The forest offered no answer. They spent 3 more days searching. Sarah documented everything with her camera, the terrain, the trees, the places where evidence had been found. She wasn't looking for Marcus's body anymore. She knew with a certainty that settled in her bones like cold that his body wasn't here to find. Whatever had happened, whatever had taken him, had been thorough. On the last day, as they were preparing to hike out, Patricia called her over to a tree about 50 yards from Marcus's last known location. It was an old cedar, massive and scarred by centuries of weather and fire, and carved into the bark, about 6 feet off the ground, was something that made Sarah's breath catch. Letters, carved deep with what looked like a knife or sharp rock. Sst, just that, a single letter, the beginning of her name. "Could be coincidence," Patricia said carefully. "Could be from anyone, carved any time." But Sarah knew Marcus's handwriting. She'd seen it in his journal, on grocery lists, in birthday cards. She knew the way he made his capital S with that distinctive curve at the top. "It's his," she said, her voice breaking. "He carved this. He was here, and he was thinking of me, and he wanted to leave something behind." Patricia examined the carving more closely. "It's fresh. Well, not fresh, but within the last few years. You can see where the bark hasn't fully healed over the cuts." Sarah pressed her hand against the tree, over that incomplete letter. This was Marcus's last message. Not the journal entry that ended mid-sentence, not the black photograph. This, her name, or the beginning of it, carved into a tree in the middle of nowhere. She wondered what had interrupted him. Why he'd only gotten 1 letter carved before. Before what? Had he heard something, seen something, or had he simply run out of time? She would never know. And in a way, that single letter said more than a complete message ever could. It said, "I was here. I thought of you. I tried." They hiked out that afternoon. Sarah turned back once to look at the forest, at the green darkness that had swallowed Marcus and kept him. She felt anger and grief and a strange kind of gratitude all mixed together. The wilderness had taken someone she loved, but it had also given her this pilgrimage, this closure, this final connection. "Goodbye, Marcus," she whispered. "I hope you found your shot." Back in Bellingham, life resumed its rhythms. Sarah returned to work, to friends, to the slow process of rebuilding a future that didn't include Marcus. But she kept his camera equipment, kept his photographs, kept that journal with its unfinished entry. She compiled his best work into a book, a coffee table volume called The Last Light, that featured his North Cascades photography alongside excerpts from his journal. The book was published in September of 2024, 3 years after his disappearance. It sold modestly but found its audience, other photographers, wilderness enthusiasts, people who understood the pull of wild places. Some readers saw it as a memorial, others saw it as a warning. Sarah included 1 page near the end that showed that final photograph, the black frame taken at 11:47 p.m. Beneath it she wrote, "This is the last image Marcus Holloway ever captured. We don't know what he saw in that darkness. We may never know. But he was trying to show us something, and I believe that matters." Detective Kowalski retired from the sheriff's office in October of that year. His last official act was closing Marcus Holloway's case file with a status of missing presumed deceased cause undetermined. It was the most honest designation he could give it. The evidence didn't support a clean conclusion. It supported only questions. But on his last day, before he locked his office door for the final time, he added one more item to the case file. It was a photograph Patricia Kimball had sent him, the picture of that carved letter on the cedar tree. And clipped to it was a handwritten note. Sometimes the wilderness keeps its secrets. Sometimes we have to accept that we'll never have all the answers. But Marcus Holloway was here. He existed. He mattered. That's not nothing. The theories continued, of course. Online forums still debated what had happened that night in the North Cascades. Some believed in the bear theory, a chance encounter gone wrong, a body hidden by the forest's efficient decomposition. Others pointed to the journal, the photographs, the strange tracks, and suggested something else, something science hadn't catalogued yet. Dr. Nguyen, the wildlife biologist, published a paper in 2025 examining unusual predator behavior in remote wilderness areas. She didn't mention Marcus specifically, but her conclusions were clear. There were gaps in our understanding of what lived in America's most isolated forests. Not because cryptids existed necessarily, but because we'd barely scratched the surface of studying large mammal behavior in areas where humans rarely went. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, she wrote in her conclusion. We assume we know what lives in our forests because we've created taxonomies and field guides, but nature doesn't read our books. And in the most remote regions where humans are scarce and observation is difficult, our knowledge becomes speculation. We simply don't know what we don't know. Sarah read that paper and felt something settle in her chest. Validation, maybe. Or just the relief of having someone in a position of authority admit that uncertainty was okay. That not knowing didn't mean you were crazy or gullible. It just meant you were honest about the limits of human understanding. She eventually moved from Bellingham to Seattle, started a new job, met new people. The apartment she'd shared with Marcus became someone else's home. His absence became something she carried, rather than something that defined her. She dated occasionally, cautiously, but part of her heart remained in that forest with a man who'd gone looking for photographs and found something else instead. On September 23rd, 2026, 5 years to the day after Marcus disappeared, Sarah drove out to the North Cascades one last time. Not to search, not to investigate, just to remember. She stood at the Diablo Lake overlook as the sun set, painting the water in shades of turquoise and gold that seemed too vivid to be real. This was the kind of light Marcus had lived for, the kind of moment he would have spent an hour photographing, waiting for that perfect instant when the world became art. She raised her own camera, not Marcus's. She'd never been able to use his equipment, and took a single photograph. The mountains, the water, the forest stretching away into blue distance. It was a good shot, properly composed and exposed. Marcus would have been proud. As darkness gathered, Sarah heard something in the forest below the overlook. A branch breaking, heavy footsteps moving through undergrowth. She froze, listening, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. The footsteps moved closer, stopped, started again. Sarah stood very still, barely breathing, and understood with perfect clarity what Marcus must have felt. This primal fear. This awareness that you're not alone, and that whatever else is there might not be friendly. She waited. The footsteps circled, paused, and then, from the darkness, an elk emerged. A huge bull with a magnificent rack of antlers, stepping out onto the road about 30 feet away. It looked at her with dark, liquid eyes, snorted once and moved past with that peculiar grace that large animals have. Sarah let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Just an elk. Just nature being nature. But as the animal disappeared back into the forest, she thought, what if Marcus had run that night, not from something predatory, but from something unexpected? What if he'd been startled by an animal, maybe even an elk like this one, and in the darkness and fear he'd fallen or gotten lost or made some fatal error in judgment? What if the monster was just his fear, amplified by night and isolation until it became something real? Or what if there really had been something else, something watching? From the shadows, something that knew these woods in ways humans never could. She would never know. None of them would. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the wilderness wasn't supposed to be fully understood or catalogued or made safe. Maybe it was supposed to remain wild, dangerous, unknowable, a place where humans could still feel small and vulnerable and alive. Could we ever truly understand what happened to Marcus Holloway, or are some mysteries meant to remain unsolved? Sarah got back in her car and drove away from the mountains as full night fell. In her rearview mirror, the North Cascades rose against the stars, dark, immense, eternal. They'd been there long before Marcus walked into them, and they'd be there long after everyone who remembered him was gone. Somewhere in those mountains, Marcus Holloway's story had ended. But the wilderness kept spinning its mysteries, kept holding its secrets, kept being exactly what it had always been: beautiful, indifferent, and utterly wild. 3 years later, in the summer of 2029, a backpacker found something near Ross Lake, about 15 miles from where Marcus's camera had been discovered. A skeleton, picked clean by scavengers and scattered by weather, but with enough remaining to make an identification through dental records. Marcus Holloway had finally come home. The autopsy revealed he'd died from blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with a fall. The medical examiner's report suggested he'd been running through difficult terrain in darkness, had tripped or stumbled, and struck his head on a rock. Death would have been quick. The report made no mention of predators or attacks, just an accident. A tragic, simple accident of the kind that kills dozens of people in wilderness areas every year. Sarah received the call on a Tuesday afternoon. She listened to Detective Kowalski, retired but still the contact person on the case, explain what they'd found, how they'd identified the remains, what the evidence suggested. She thanked him. She called Marcus's parents. She made the necessary arrangements. And then she sat in her Seattle apartment and cried, not from renewed grief, but from relief. He'd been found. The not knowing was finally over. She could stop wondering if he was still out there somehow, could stop the torture of hope that kept her scanning crowds for his face. But late that night, alone in the darkness, she thought about the journal, about the thing Marcus had described circling his tent, about the fear in his words, about tracks that didn't quite match any known animal, about a camera buried deliberately beneath moss and soil. The official explanation said, accident. The evidence supported it. Marcus had run through the forest in darkness, disoriented by fear or confusion, and had fallen. Everything else, the strange tracks, the journal entries, the buried evidence, could be explained by the chaos of a panicked mind and the forest's natural processes. That was the rational story, the one that fit the known world. But Sarah remembered standing at that overlook, hearing footsteps in the darkness, feeling the weight of being watched. She remembered Patricia's grandmother's stories about the old ones in the deep forest. She remembered Dr. Nguyen's paper about the limits of human knowledge. And she thought, maybe both things are true. Maybe Marcus did fall and die in the darkness. And maybe something had chased him there. Maybe the wilderness killed him through simple physics, gravity and stone and bad luck. And maybe something unknowable had set those physics in motion. The world didn't have to choose between rational and mysterious. Both could exist simultaneously. Science could be right about the cause of death and still be missing part of the story. Sarah opened her laptop and looked at Marcus's photographs one last time. She stopped at that final image, the black frame taken at 11:47 p.m. She'd looked at it hundreds of times, enhanced it, studied it, tried to pull meaning from those dark pixels. This time she simply accepted it for what it was, an attempt to see something in darkness, an effort to capture truth, even when truth was invisible, an act of witness. You tried to show us, she whispered to the screen. Whatever it was, you tried. She closed the laptop and looked out her window at the Seattle skyline, at the lights of civilization that pushed back darkness and made the world feel safe and known. But beyond the city, she knew, the wilderness still existed, still held its mysteries, still harbored questions that might never have answers. Marcus Holloway had walked into that wilderness and never walked out. The official record would say he died from a fall. His death certificate would list accidental trauma as the cause. The case would be closed, filed away, eventually forgotten by everyone except those who'd loved him. But somewhere in the North Cascades, carved into a cedar tree that would stand for another 500 years, a single letter remained. An incomplete message. A fragment of a story that didn't have an ending, or had too many endings, or had an ending that couldn't be spoken in words. Sarah fell asleep that night thinking about that letter, about Marcus with his knife or sharp rock, carving her name into bark, trying to leave something of himself behind, trying to say, "I was here. I loved you. Remember me." The wilderness had taken him, but it had also preserved that moment, that gesture, that love. And in the end, maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all any of us could hope for. To be remembered, to have mattered, to leave some small mark on the world before the darkness swallowed us whole. The North Cascades kept their secrets, but they'd given back what mattered most. Not answers, but closure. Not explanations, but peace. Marcus Holloway had gone into the wild to capture beauty, and the wild had kept him. It was terrible, it was tragic, it was a mystery that would never be fully solved, and it was, in its own way, a kind of grace.